We are hours away from free agency officially beginning, and the Bucks already making one move. We break down the Bobby Portis extension and everything else we've seen this Sunday afternoon on the latest Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined once again by Camille Davis and Frank Madden. We thank you for making this your first listen of the day, each and every day. Today's episode of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. We had the soft start to free agency as teams were free and clear to negotiate with their own guys. As soon as the finals ended, and we've seen a few deals start to trickle out, mostly all from the same position with bigs, as the Minnesota Timberwolves are reportedly keeping both of their guys in Naz Reid and Julius Randle, and the Bucks are keeping Bobby Portis for a deal that is relatively similar to what Bobby Portis was earning the past year or so here at just over $14 million that this is going to clock in at for Bobby, and a 3-year deal. So the first domino for the Bucks has fallen. Camille, you brought it up before we started recording too. The grade that was given to this by ESPN was a C-. And was there any further context on that?
Yeah, ESPN didn't like the deal as much because they felt as if the age component of the Bobby Portis dilemma here of like, well, he's going to be 33 by the time this contract ends, so it's not going to age super well from him. He's not a great rim protector, and if you're asking him to play center, like you're over indexing what you want from Bobby Portis. So ultimately, ESPN wasn't very high on it. Me personally, when I saw what he was coming in for, after seeing the Naz Reid contract, where I was like, dang, they're going to give Naz Reid 25 M's a year. I was like, whew, like that's pretty steep. And for a second, it made me nervous about what the Bobby Portis market might look like, with the understanding Bobby is older. So like, of course, I don't think it's going to be 25 million a year annually, but could it get too expensive for the Bucks to be able to retain him? But all in all, the Bucks reach a 3-year, $44 million deal with Bobby Portis to keep him in Milwaukee. And I like the deal. Again, it's not too expensive. I could see it being a little rich for some people, but just given what the Bucks need this coming season, with the likelihood that Brook Lopez is probably not returning. And again, we don't know how free agency will shake out, but especially if you lose a Brook Lopez, having that consistency there in your front court, I think will be helpful. And ultimately too, it's a contract that if things go a certain way, could be very tradable for the Bucks as well. So I do like the aspect of it as well.
Frank? I was going to say, Justin, I think we, on Thursday night, I think when we last potted, we said, expect this deal, the first year salary to be between his current player option, right? Which, would have been the opt-in sort of scenario, and the mid-level exception, which was 14.1. I think his current number was about 13.5. So it was a very tight range that we said, like, this is probably the narrow window that it's going to fit into. And Eric Name reporting tonight that even though it's a new deal, it starts at his exact same number that he was going to be at, which I think was like 13.5, which is a little below the full mid-level exception. And so I think we talked about, is maybe the best case scenario was honestly that maybe that he just took the player option and he's on an expiring contract, just given the uncertainty around where the Bucks are and his age, blah, blah, blah. He is 30 in Ringer/ESPN years. That makes him 32. So Giannis, Zach loaded it again on Friday. He said Giannis was 31. Giannis doesn't turn 31 for another 5 months, but makes me wonder, like, when he turns 31, does he automatically become 32?
36.
Does the Ringer then call him 32? Does he jump to 33? So anyway, but yeah, so I mean, we'll see aging curve wise, I'm always sort of two minds with this, because I always think of Jared Dudley for some reason, because of the whole, like, he doesn't have much athleticism to lose, with similar conversations around Chris Middleton as well. You know, guys like this, okay, as they get into their early 30s, positional stuff matters as well. I think you always worry most about small guards and their aging curves, just because they do tend to require quickness. Dame I will have lots of conversations around Dame, obviously, especially coming out the injury. But I think with Bobby, it's the offensive skill factor, the shooting. Kind of interesting to look back. I mean, he shot so poorly to start last year. We had a ton of negativity generally around Bobby start to the season. And then he started to get things going, right? I mean, him and Gary Trent Jr. both had really cold starts to the year. And then Bobby figured it out, and, his percentages kind of got to where they usually get. And the other thing with Bobby too, it's interesting. And, this is the two sides of the coin, I think, with Bobby and Brook. You look at his playoff numbers. I mean, I'd say 2-3 years ago, like, the thing we always said about Bobby was, it's like, well, yeah, but it's like, look at that Nets series, on the championship, he just pretty much didn't play. And that concern about, like, well, if you're switching or he's having to protect the rim, like, how do you avoid teams really exploiting some of his limitations on defense? And I think, first off, to his credit, I know we've talked about this, there were a number of games last year where, like, he actually, like, made defensive plays. I remember there was a game in Cleveland, I think it was when Giannis missed the first game in Cleveland, where it was really close. He made, like, repeated, like, blocks and steals in the fourth quarter of that game. And again, it's not to say he's like a plus defender or something like that, but I think this was a season where I didn't really notice his limitations on defense nearly as much. I don't think he's going to get better defensively as he ages, to be clear. But also just his playoff numbers, like, I think pretty much every year, I was looking at this earlier, pretty much every year in the playoffs, he's been a positive net differential guy, even though the last 2 years, the Bucks have not obviously fared well. And his on-off numbers, right? So the difference between when he's on versus off has been huge. I mean, like 20 to 30 points swings when he's on versus off. And obviously, the flip side of this coin is the fact that Brook Lopez minutes, especially these last two playoff series against the Indiana Pacers, just haven't worked, right? And I think the upside with both Brook and Bobby is, regular season wise, these guys just roll out the ball. They come to play. They, knock on wood, have both been super durable. Bobby, obviously, the suspension last year was really the one exception to that. But health wise, hopefully he continues to just be able to play night in and night out, which has always been super helpful, especially when Giannis misses games. And of course, I think not just like the kind of thinness of the big man market, the importance of the Bucks have some big, besides, like, they have 3 bigs from last year that are all free agents. I think Bobby was kind of the safest guy to bet on, just because obviously he's younger than Brook. I think he's, a guy that has held up better in the playoffs, and is stylistically, like, you can say he doesn't have like a real offensive systemic strength, but he's also, I think, a bit more malleable against different types of defenses, because obviously he is more mobile than Brook is. So he obviously was a guy I think you wanted to keep. And, I think obviously just the relationship with the city is, you don't sign him because of that, but I think it's something that everybody, at the end of the day, feels really good about. The fact that you get to keep a guy who obviously has meant a lot to this team, has meant a lot to Giannis, has meant a lot to the state, the franchise, all those things. And it's just a feel good story. And it's just like, Bobby Portis going to some other team at this age, like, that would have been just weird. Like, would he, like, he's not going to ever have that sort of relationship with, I think, another city. And so I think it's just nice to see him kind of keep it going here in Milwaukee, and we'll see what happens. I think it will be a tradable contract. Warriors fans were very interested in him as a potential target. And I think, stretch bigs who can guard kind of 4 or 5, or at least be playable at the 4 and 5. I mean, those guys are going to have value. So it's not that you're going to flip them for some big haul or something like that. But I think if you need to go a different direction at some point, I think you'll have at least some options. So shout out to Bobby. I think, I think we've all had sort of mixed feelings about sort of his limitations and his strengths, and sort of some of the trade-offs around that. But at the end of the day, I think, especially when you put on your fan hat, like, it's a feel-good story for him to coming back. And I think the number is very reasonable. And And especially when you look, as Camille, as you pointed out, like some of the other numbers that we've been seeing for bigs in this marketplace, I think we knew that there really wasn't a market necessarily for Bobby to do more than the mid-level, but you never know, right? And a lot of times teams do overpay just because they feel like they should. Kind of like, I think that's what that Naz Reid number was from Minnesota. But here the Bucks, I think, did something that was reasonable, and obviously Bobby, he's happy to sign it, and we move on.
I've got a few thoughts on it, but then I do want to pivot to the two big positions for the Bucks in this free agency period, the backcourt and the big men, and what the market is going to tell us, especially for their guards and players like Gary Trent Jr. So we'll get into that conversation coming up after this. Time to talk to you about FanDuel. It's summertime, meaning sports are in full swing. Whether you're about baseball, taking as many games as you can, getting under the lights, golfing on the greens, or high-stakes soccer action, FanDuel's the best way to make every game even more exciting. You're already following the action, so why not make it a little more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game with your friends, and while they're getting sunburned at the beach. Whether you're placing a same-game parlay or watching a bet ride into the ninth inning, FanDuel makes it feel as though you're a part of the action. It's easy to use. You get paid out fast. That makes even regular season games feel like must-watch events. If you're new to FanDuel, new customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. I mean, and the interesting part, I agree with that last part, that it's at the very least, this is a tradable contract. If it's right in there around the mid-level figure, and it's not a 5-year deal, it's a 3-year deal. To me, the most interesting part about this is, I mean, it's a deal you have to do for the reasons you brought up, Frank, too, of like, well, you can't be left without a chair to sit in. You need one big at least. But just what happens with Giannis is the interesting part with this deal, in that, hey, if we would have known if something happens, then maybe this is a summer that we could look to start to get off of some of that money. So that's the one part about this deal. But to get him for that value, especially when you look at the $25 million a year that Naz Reid got, I'll sign up for that. Camille and I were talking before we started recording, before you jumped on, Frank. My only thing with this one was, I'm just curious of what the market was for Bobby, and maybe there was an offer out there for the full mid-level. But I mean, the tricky part is there's two teams that could pay him more than that. And, other teams he's been linked to, we're talking about the $14.1 million. And I just don't know that those teams that we've heard Bobby Portis popping up with, like, are you going to give him that full figure? So that was the one thing that struck me of, what was the market for him to get $14 million from another team? Maybe it was, and all it takes is one team to do that. But I suppose I would rather have Bobby Portis in hand than try to test that and say, hey, if you think you can get $14 million, go shop it, and then lose out on him. So that's the danger that you get with that. And look, the other thing too, on a lighter note, is if there's a gap year, if things take a little bit of a downturn for the Bucks this upcoming season, you still want to have some fun. And Bobby Portis is one of the reasons to get out there and keep following this team. So it's important in that sense as well. Before we pivot to the guards and centers too. So I was talking with you guys on Friday that I was told by someone there would be a press conference happening on Friday for a different event, and that Bobby Portis is going to be there and make an announcement. So it immediately put me into scramble mode, and talking with you guys and talking with Eric too, of, have you heard anything about this, and trying to figure out, like, are they actually going to announce an extension or what here? And it was canceled at the last minute, but now we get the news that Bobby Portis is agreeing to a contract extension, or a new deal with the Bucks, I should say. The other big name to touch on, we'll get to Brook Lopez in a minute, but Gary Trent Jr., I think all three of us said coming into the offseason, that's the number one priority for this group because of what he did down the stretch and his age. And, we talk about the interesting part of, like, what are the other offers out there for Bobby Portis. I mean, I'm really interested now, especially in light of the Malik Beasley news and what that does to the market for Gary Trent Jr. If it takes Malik Beasley off and bumps everybody else up a line, if the Pistons are saying, hey, we'll throw this money at Gary Trent Jr. or another team that misses out on Nickeil Alexander-Walker or Quentin Grimes, Gary Trent Jr. moves up on their board. So I do wonder if, let's say Gary Trent Jr. does re-sign with the Bucks, if the figure ends up being not insanely higher, but at least moderately higher than we expected, if this is why.
Yeah, that news made me nervous for that reason. Outside of the fact that the Malik Beasley alleged gambling scheme, ring, whatever you want to call it, happened while he was in a Bucks uniform, which brings up a whole nother set of questions that I have of like, what was he betting on? Who was he betting on? So as that information comes out, I'll definitely be paying attention. But with him having this situation, like it came out too that he was in talks with the Pistons to sign like a 3-year, $42 million deal with them. And now that's all put on pause while all this litigation plays out. So for me, I think best case scenario from a Buck standpoint is that now on their list, it's not a Gary Trent Jr. moves up. It's more so like a, hey, Dennis Schroeder, we were cool with letting you walk away before, but now we might be a little bit more interested in bringing you back with Ivy coming back, because it seemed initially as if they felt cool with Schroeder walking away because they're like, Ivy can handle that backup point guard situation. But if there's no Malik Beasley, maybe they look at it as like, okay, maybe we can use Ivy and Dennis Schroeder at the same time and go from there since there's some familiarity there. But it does make me a little bit nervous about the Gary Trent Jr. aspect of it too. It's like, will the Pistons just look to cash out at a level that the Bucks would not? And not like they have a whole lot of cap space in Detroit, but like, could they offer him more than what the Bucks
create a decent amount though?
Yeah.
Yeah, and there was talk about them, trying to see if someone would take or absorb Simone Fontecchio. Makes about $8 million to free up some additional money. And fortunately, like as soon as the Beasley thing happened, I mean, first of all, it's like, it's sad, right? Like you hope a guy is not throwing away it's not life altering money. I mean, he's obviously had big contracts before, but he's not a guy it's not like we're talking about somebody who's like made $200 million in his career. Like this next deal is pretty critical probably to like, his lifestyle over the rest of his life and, his kids' lifestyles, etc. And so like, if any of this is true or if it's not true, right? I mean, even if nothing comes of this, like,
I mean, look,
the door
is here.
Yeah. Like the window here is like, what's going to happen? Is he going to be like, are they going to clear him in the next 48 hours? Like, and then he's going to be able to sign his contract? No, he does not have bird rights with the Pistons. So like, this is a ticking thing. Like they need to use their cap space. And, I think the good news for the Bucks, knock on wood so far, is that we haven't heard reference to Gary Trent Jr., but if they create some cap space, they could use that to, first off, again, Beasley doesn't have bird rights. They also have, Schroeder and Tim Hardaway Jr. are also sort of floating around, as you alluded to, Camille, with Schroeder. Tim Hardaway, by the way, has anyone made a ton of money for longer without like anybody knowing why he gets paid it than Tim Hardaway? It's like someone decided he was making a lot of money for a long time, and I'm sure Gary Trent looks at him and just like, man, is this guy finally? Yeah, I was like, this is the guy who should be signing a minimum contract. So we'll see kind of what happens with those guys. But I know there's mention of Nickeil Alexander-Walker or Karis LeVert. Karis LeVert potentially, if Nickeil Alexander-Walker ends up in Atlanta, then Karis LeVert could end up in Detroit. Mm-hmm. I'm all for that. Like, go Pistons, use your money on one of those guys. Don't be paying attention to Gary Trent, who, oh, by the way, does a lot of the stuff that Malik Beasley does. Not as high volume a 3-point shooter or prolific a 3-point shooter. But I would rather have Gary Trent, if we're talking about, having seen both of these guys in Bucks uniforms the last 2 years, I would happily just take back Gary Trent. I think he's a bit better defender, and I don't know, like I just felt like his fit kind of was a little bit cleaner last year than Malik's was when he was kind of forced to be a starter. So So yeah, we'll kind of see what happens with all that. But as you said, Justin, it's a big musical chairs game. And I tweeted out after Sam Merrill, former Buck, got his 4-year, $38 million contract that, we're starting to see, I think, a market for AJ Green's eventual. He's still under contract. He's got another cheap year left, which, but he'll then be extension eligible. And I think the, parameters of what you would want to give him as an early extension are kind of pretty clear, somewhere between like the Merrill number. Sam Hauser is making 445. I know we're like racially profiling him here. We always joke about people racially profiling him and attacking him on defense and then being surprised. I think he's a better defender than either of those guys, but something in that, kind of $10 to $12 million range, especially, when you think about it too, like this would be for next year. The cap is going up 15% every year, right? So if you could get him, 4 years, 10, 12 million, I think you'd probably say that's pretty good business to keep AJ. And a couple people said like, oh, well, why would AJ get more money than Gary Trent? And I would say, I think there's at least a reasonable case to be made that Gary Trent is quote unquote better in some objective sense than AJ. I was looking back at their numbers again. I mean, first off, like AJ's volume as a 3-point shooter has actually gone down each of these 3 seasons in the NBA. Like they were actually both around like 8 threes attempted per 36, which is good, but not in the like rarefied, like actually Malik Beasley, Steph, like Dame, like levels of like 10 plus threes attempted per 36. Obviously AJ's lights out from that range. Gary was also obviously great shooting from 3 last year, especially after those early struggles. I think Gary's obviously a better NBA scorer at this point, and just in terms of like getting to other shots, whereas AJ is really just a pure floor stretcher. But I would say, more dynamic shooter, I would say is AJ. I would say AJ is a better, at least like more consistent defender, whereas Gary's more of a gambler in terms of like going for steals and things like that. But you could say obviously like if you have AJ, like it's not the end of the world if you can't get Gary back, because you can start AJ, and I think the presumption is one of those guys is going to be your starting shooting guard. But I think especially with Giannis, like and without Dame, like you're going to need guys that can put the ball in the hole. And so I think you'd like to keep both of them. And I think the reason why some said like why would Gary make less money than AJ in an extension? And again, like we just hit on it with Beasley as well, but always it comes down to obviously how good you are, your age, but then also do you have bird rights? Are there teams out there with either cap space or exceptions that can meet your needs? And so yes, I mean there are teams obviously with non-tax mid-level available for Gary, who could theoretically give him up to $14 million a year that way. If Brooklyn decided they wanted to pay him that or more, in theory, Brooklyn could do that. Or the Pistons, right? If they decide like, forget all these other guys, like we could do that. But the reality is like, if the team you play for doesn't have your bird rights and can't offer you a big money deal, because the Bucks can't do that, right? The Bucks have to use part of their mid-level exception, which they obviously want to keep part of that available for KPJ. If Brook leaves, they have to figure out a way to replace Brook, who does have bird rights, which again, like Brook and Bobby, like they're going to make more money, even if you think, they're not as important, whatever it might be, like that really helps their ability to get those kind of bigger dollar numbers. So that's the reason why I think there's a chance the Bucks could get Gary for a lower figure. I think it was Jim Ozarski put in, I think his mailbag in the Journal Sentinel about like a $7 to $10 million like price range for Gary was sort of his market. And, I think for a lot of teams, Gary's number would be the taxpayer mid-level or under, because if you give a guy that, then, you're not hard capped at the first apron. But that's only like 6 million. So who's going to go to a bigger number? Again, I think some teams should. I think he's worth that. But if you're the Bucks, I think you're telling Rich Paul, his agent, like, well, hey man, we got to keep some money available. We don't know what's going to happen with Brook. Might need to replace Brook in the open market. We got to keep KPJ. Keep in mind the Bucks do also have the biannual exception, which is over $5 million. that feels like a KPJ sized chunk of money. So in theory, if you really wanted to keep Gary and wanted to pay him the full mid-level exception, you could do that and pay KPJ the $5 million figure. But then suddenly you're getting very tight on, do you have enough money for another center or two centers, including Jericho Sims? What do you have left for Ryan Rollins, et cetera? Because I think all our assumption is that the Bucks are not just going to stay under the first apron, but also stay under the luxury tax this year, which is about 187. So yeah, it's a tough spot to be in, but I mean, this is just sort of the reality. Like whenever people are like, oh, that guy's going to get paid probably this amount of money, it's just like, okay, well, if it's a higher number, my point is always like, who's paying him that, and how many teams can pay him that, and who is actually going to offer him that? And again, with Gary, I mean, like, I think the base of suitors should be large. I'm sure lots of teams would happily take him for, a minimum, or like
what the Bucks paid, or
$4 million
his contract last year.
Exactly. But like, that's obviously not what he's looking for. And again, like, I think the other piece too is if he signs for that type of number, I would expect it's probably a 1+1, because then he has early bird rights and he can get paid 105% of what the average salary is this year, which I don't know what that'll be, but probably somewhere in the teens, like low teens. So I think that's kind of where the Gary market is. And, I think in general for the Bucks, we've said this for prior years, no news is generally good news if you're looking for bargains. Like the deals that get announced on day one of free agency, Ersan Ilyasova signing for the mid-level exception, however many years ago that was. Guys aren't signing that because you're bargain hunting and lowballing them. It's because they're like, oh crap, we're gonna lock in this mid-level deal from the Bucks, and 5 years ago or whenever that was. No, longer than that, I guess 6 years. I don't know when it was, but that Ersan got
2019,
something like that. Yeah. So if basically that's all to say, like the longer Gary kind of sits out on the market, like that's probably better for the Bucks, because unless they go off and spend that money elsewhere, you would think that they're keeping some powder dry to bring him back. And obviously the Bobby number, not I think you're worried about is that Bobby's number went higher, and if it goes $2-3 million higher, that appreciably impacts what you can pay all these other guys. But keeping him where essentially he was, that's what I had in my spreadsheet. I had him at exactly his PO number, and that's what he's coming back at. So I think, all of that keeps the Bucks on course for, being able to retain the guys that they want to retain. But again, more work to do, and we'll see if kind of they can hopefully also have something else up their sleeves. It would be nice to not just like run back a team that like doesn't seem like has a very high ceiling, but at a minimum, like I think obviously there's a number of guys that, especially some of the younger guys, not Bobby or Brook Lopez, but the wings and guards, obviously there were a number of guys there that we like that are still hopefully guys that can have some upside and could grow into, bigger roles this year, especially with Dame out.
So then on to the other big question, and that is the future of Brook Lopez. Did some news that came out late Sunday night, does that change any of the market for Brook Lopez? We'll take a look at that next. So Brook Lopez is one of the more interesting free agents out there, because it really does seem like you have a lot of people outside of the Bucks fan circle that are kind of making the same point too, of still valuable, still one of the better rim protectors. He can stretch the floor, and how valuable that is. And not to get lost in the shuffle too, that's the other important piece about Bobby staying here, is you need a floor stretching big to play alongside Giannis. You can't have two non-shooters on the floor and have a successful offense in this league. So that's a big piece there. I think we all think he's going to get a number that starts with a 1. But I mean, I wonder, some of the teams that you've heard him linked to, like the Lakers, the Warriors, does DeAndre Ayton all of a sudden hitting the market and getting a buyout, what does that mean for the market for Brook Lopez? And is that a guy that's going to jump in front of him because of his age, even if you can question just about everything else that comes with the game of DeAndre Ayton?
That motor, Bit inconsistent from DeAndre Ayton. And I mean, honestly, too, he's younger, but he still doesn't space the floor the way that a Brook Lopez can do. And that is such a valuable skill set in today's NBA. So I think for the Ayton being, or what's it, working on a buyout now with the Portland Trail Blazers, I think that might make the LA situation interesting because Brook to LA always, like, from my understanding, his first stint in LA didn't necessarily go great. Just the lifestyle of it all and just not a great fit. So while the idea of Brook Lopez back to the Lakers makes sense because they need a center, he can space the floor. We also have heard that, the type of big that Luka likes to play with is a bit more agile, a bit more of a rim runner, which, I mean, we've seen Brook do a little rim running, but it's not in the same vein of the type of bigs that Luka tends to want to play with. So, like, I think that makes the Lakers situation maybe not as much of a fit for Brook Lopez, even though I mentioned, like, it wasn't much of a fit when he was there the first time around. But I think ultimately, though, teams are still going to value the skill set that Brook has because it's hard to get a 7-footer that can block 100 shots and make 100 threes in the same season.
I'm going to ask both of you before you share your thoughts, Frank. DeAndre Ayton's played 7 years in the league. How many threes do you think he's hit in his career?
17.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. I'll go. Well, and I guess not. This isn't Price is Right. I'll go 16. I'll go 16. I'll go slightly under.
Like Camille, you mentioned it, and I do think a lot of people have seen DeAndre Ayton hit a three, and wow, he's a floor stretching big. He's hit 28 in his 7 years of playing in the NBA, and he's only had 1 year where he shot in the 30%. He's a career 23% 3-point shooter.
And I was looking at his numbers earlier tonight after the news hit, and I mean, he's really, I think he got better his first like few years. Like statistically, it's just an interesting kind of story for him because he kind of came out of the box and was like, double productive guy, put up numbers, but has never been the defensive impact guy that you would have wanted him to be. Has never stretched out, Camille, as you said. Like that was one of the main things, I think, if you talk about just like what's been disappointing about the arc of his career. I think the motor questions and just like, like the last couple of years, like what's even his interest in being in Portland after being traded.
None when it snows.
Yeah. And then, just not evolving his game to be that sort of like modern 3-point shooting big, even though he's, a guy like, I mean, I feel like every time I've seen him play, it's like, man, it feels like that mid-range is like money from him.
Good, yeah.
But like, it's not 1997. Like that's nice, but he could be even more dynamic, obviously, if he could stretch out. And I don't know really why he wouldn't be able to do that. So we'll see, but it's kind of interesting. It's like what the idea of pairing him with, Luka in LA. You would obviously hope that kind of move would kind of animate him to an extent that maybe he hasn't been the last couple of years, just in terms of like the effort, motor, that sort of stuff. But I mean, that's always sort of like, a dangerous game to be playing, the Arrested Development, like like people thinking this is going to work out for them, but it might work for us. Right. But because I don't think of him as like a rim runner either, even though
me either necessarily
should be that like guy, I guess. So yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, you have guys like Capella out there too. I feel like Capella could be a good fit for the Lakers. I'd say that's a more traditional, just sort of like rim running type guy that would be, I'd say, a clean fit with Luka. I mean, ironically, Trey and Luka being connected for so long, Trey Young and Luka from draft night. Clint Capella got very used to catching alley-oops from Trey Young over, the course of his time in Atlanta. And, I think he could do certainly some similar things with Luka, although, he's not the kind of, maybe quite as young and spry as he once was. So we'll see. But I mean, I think the upside for Brook, I mean, he's not that kind of electric athlete rim runner type guy, but
you also don't question his desire, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And he's, like basically like a 3-level pick and roll threat. Like he can obviously pop, He can drop for deep threes. Obviously, he's like got that dynamite little push shot from the foul line if he's short rolling. And then, like, especially when Chris Middleton was around, like, I mean, he would go all the way to the rim plenty. I mean, Giannis, how many times did Giannis kind of run pick and rolls or find him, kind of diving to the rim? So, yeah, I mean, I think Brook would be a very nice fit there. And I think Brook's the hardest guy to peg in terms of the Bucks, just because I think a lot of people kind of look at him for the reasons I mentioned, right? Like you talk about like just like his on-off numbers in the playoffs these last few years, and what does that speak to? Like, does that speak to just he's too situational in terms of like a playoff series at this point to kind of bet at least big money on at this stage? That's certainly, I think that's a and I'm as big a Brook Lopez fan as there has been. I think we've generally all been very supportive of Brook, but I think it's a little bit interesting because, like, candidly, I don't really see the Bucks being much of a postseason threat. So on some level, they kind of need to just like start by just figuring out how they make the best regular season team they can to like win enough games. Like, it's way more important that they win,
which would increase the importance of keeping Brook.
Yeah. It's like a little weird, right? Because it's way more important that they get to the 5th, 6th seed, I think, than be like a more malleable like 8 or 9 seed on some level. So like, is that a true trade-off? It's an interesting question, because I mean, like we said, even at his age, other than the year where he had the back surgery, like Brook's been a guy that, just shows up every night and plays no matter. I mean, all the other starters are resting, and there's Brook Lopez out there, putting up, more points, picking up the load, whatever it might be. So it's hard. I think, I think there's just some natural limitations on what the Bucks can pay him and keep these other guys. So I think that's really, for me, it's more about like, you can't pay him much because then you can't keep these other guys who I think are younger and more malleable, more so than like, you need to just get rid of Brook Lopez for the sake of it. I do think if he comes back, I think there's obviously a good case for just not starting him for the first time since he came here, just because like, hey, we got to just start off in a different mode than we have. Again, is that the best path to winning regular season games? I don't know. But it's certainly, I think, something that you'd have to look at, especially after what we saw in the playoffs last spring. So we'll see what happens with Brook. I think, is there sign and trade options that could be available? I always sort of caution people, because I feel like people love to like push the sign and trade button when it's like a free agent they don't really want to keep. And it's just like, oh, someone else will want to give us stuff for this guy that I don't really want. And I always think of like Jabari Parker, when Jabari left for Chicago, and it's just like, yeah, like you don't generally get much for sign and trade deals. And I think with Brook, the leverage would have to be, you get like a Warriors team that just is desperate for like a reliable,
pay him more than
exactly. And then, you get in a situation where like I think your dream scenario there would be like, can you extract Moses Moody? I'm not even going to talk about like Kuminga, because I think Kuminga's probably making, more money than the Bucks would ever want.
Kuminga's going to be in a sign and trade of his own too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that's the thing, like, all the Kuminga stuff, like, because of base year compensation rules, like it probably has to be like a 3-way trade.
Yeah.
But like, could there be some like really, Brook is a Northern California guy. Like, could there be some sort of like difficult to parse Brook to Golden State and Jonathan Kuminga somewhere, and then the Bucks get, some useful stuff, but also not too much, because again, like, the Warriors, I don't think are going to want to give up a whole lot, and especially if they're already giving up Kuminga, then it's probably like, well, can you get something from the other team? Would have been Milwaukee, right? Like the Heat have been thrown out, but the Heat seem to be saying like, oh, we don't actually want any of these people, like, which is okay, interesting. So we'll see, but yeah, I mean, is Brook a guy that gets action on day one? I imagine there'll be discussion about him on day one. I don't think Brook's gonna like have to wait like 3 or 4 days to get, some attention, just because the big depth is so bad. But I agree. I mean, I think the Ayton news, I think, certainly helps the Bucks if they want to keep Brook. But but if they want to sign and trade him, maybe not so much.
What's the number? And like we talked before about like what's your walkaway figure, but like literally because of some of the mechanisms the Bucks are gonna have to use to keep these guys, they're gonna be hard capped. So what's the figure gonna be? Like $7 or $8 million, basically?
I think for Brook to be here,
yeah,
or even less.
Yeah, I mean,
ideally less.
That's kind of what I kind of bookmarked was something on the order of, I think, 8 million was kind of like probably the most you could pay him and, keep all the guys you want to keep. Again, like there's obviously, it's kind of hard to say with Gary being kind of a bit of a wild card, what you're gonna have to pay Gary. Ryan Rollins, I think, is another guy we haven't talked about. I think Ryan will probably have to, you don't see guys target sort of like random restricted guys on like the first day of free agency. So we'll see kind of what Ryan's market looks like. But if you kind of just start like doing the math kind of pretty quickly, I'm just kind of like slotting in some
I mean, like if we assume $14.1 million between Gary Trent Jr. and Kevin Porter Jr. You would still have two guys to add to the mix?
Yeah. So like if I put Brook at 8, Bobby's at 13.4. If I put Kevin Porter at 5, and I put Gary Trent at, let's say, 8 and Ryan Rollins at 4, I've got 13 guys and I'm already at 187 million, which is like 600. It's like basically there's 600,000 under the tax threshold, and that's with 13 guys. So you need to replace. You still have Jericho Sims, who you want to bring back. So even if he takes the minimum, now you're like a little less than 2 million over the tax, and then people like Taurean Prince has sort of been the forgotten man. I know nobody's excited about the idea of bringing back Taurean Prince, but like you need
you get him the 120, and I do think
you need a wing. You need a wing. Like it's not him. So that's like another couple $1,000,000 if that's like the Thanasis. We haven't talked about the Thanasis.
We haven't talked about that, but I also
and is floating around on the roster as well. But like,
But I do think I agree with you that the mission statement is probably let's avoid the tax because we're in the repeater tax, but you can also get out of the tax during the season. So if it means rounding out your roster and then making one of those moves going into the deadline where you send away a guy for a second rounder, or you make some type of move that trims $6 million off payroll or something, that can get you under.
Well, and the other ripcord that I know we talked about a little while back, we've referenced, which I think the most interesting thing would be if the Bucks are like, and we haven't talked about like Bogolyub, who like if he were to come over, he actually helps because you can put your own second round picks at like the actual number they get, which is generally lower than a regular minimum contract.
It's what, like contract. 2 points something. It's basically just look at most of the Bucks roster through the years.
So I think I think the question is, like, Tyler Smith was at 1.1 last year, so it'll probably be like 1.3-ish or so is what you get Bogolyub at, which is probably at like close to $1 million less than a regular minimum contract, which matters, in these sorts of things. But I think the interesting question is like, okay, if you end up with this full roster and you're, let's say, 3-4 million over the tax, I think what is it, August 30th, I think is the deadline for stretching guys in the last year of their contracts. Pat Connaughton, if you stretch him, you shave off 6 million. And so you end up in the situation where you're having, John, I'm sure if you're ownership, you're telling John, they're asking John Horst, like, okay, do you stretch and waive this guy who immediately gets us under the tax? We have to carry, some of his salary over the next, like a few $1,000,000, basically like $3 million over the next 2 additional years on the cap, which, not the end of the world. But
we've seen worse here.
Yeah, we've seen worse, right? Or do you take that into the year because that expiring contract could also make it easier to make trades and things like that, right?
Yeah.
So it's a kind of a tough play to figure out. And again, like I think I think like Brook is kind of like the big, kind of pivot point for all of these decisions. Cause I think, again, Gary's probably maybe like the most important decision, but I think like Brook is if you don't bring back Brook, then you have like very limited opportunities to improve your center position. Well, let me say this, you're not going to improve your center position. Probably you're just going to play differently. It's totally a stylistic bet, right? Like, can you get Nick Richards by using that trade exception, that $7 million trade exception? Would Phoenix just give them away, making $5 million, right? That would obviously be cheaper and give you some more flexibility. But like, other than that, like, I don't know if there was any big guys you liked when you looked at the list. The guy I looked at, I was like, I don't know, like maybe Paul Reed if you're like trying to play more mobile. But then I was just like, yeah, Paul Reed, I don't know that he's too excited about playing for Doc Rivers after not playing a whole lot for Doc in Philly. So it's definitely tough. And again, like for the Bucks, you don't have like, a bunch of second round picks you can use to make sort of these marginal moves. I think if you're going to make a move and you have to put value in, like I kind of drift towards Andre Jackson Jr. Like maybe that's the guy you have to give up, which is especially hard when you have like so little wing depth on this team.
Yeah. And for those curious too, there's 4 teams that are in the second apron. What's going to be interesting about DeAndre Ayton is anyone can sign him. So the whole provision of you can't sign a buyout guy making above the mid-level, it only applies in the season. So teams that are in that list, and the Lakers are not one of them, can bring him in. But just seeing where he lands is going to be interesting because of what it means for, was it a team that was in on Brook and they say, hey, this guy's younger and he does some other things, let's throw our money into that. Does the market go very cold on him? And we see Brook Lopez as one of the guys that other teams sense blood in the water for everything we just went through and saying it's going to be tough for the Bucks to keep him and stay under the tax. And even, does Brook want to come back for a quote unquote gap year? Like Frank, as you termed it, of I don't think the Bucks are going to be a serious threat in the playoffs this year. I mean, it's funny to hear coming off of 3 straight first round exits where they were also not a serious threat in the playoffs.
Expectations are different now. Like that's the difference. If this is a Bucks team that gets to the playoffs and they make it out the first round, I think most people would be like, wow,
man, what a celebration.
What's going on in Milwaukee right there?
Well, and I mean, like, as we were saying, right, like the top 4 seeds, if the Bucks are not a top 4 seed, then you're talking about, Cleveland. I think Cleveland will be very good. I definitely interesting to see if they make a big move this summer. This whole LeBron like soft launch of a trade request, I'm still confused about that. Like, all I know is like LeBron has said way more than Giannis has ever said, and like people are way less interested.
Like the verbiage and the wording too about competing for championships when the team just traded for Luka Doncic.
Yeah, it's all very weird. But I think Cleveland, regardless of what happens, I think Cleveland will at a minimum be a great regular season team. And then after that, Boston's down the pecking order some ways. I think as far as who else is kind of in that mix, I know Indiana, obviously same argument, right? Like they're presumably like knocked way down the mix because of Halliburton's absence. I think the Knicks are a team you assume will get a coach who can figure out how to get them to 50-some.
I don't know if we
wins.
can assume they'll get a coach.
They'll still be trying to hire other teams' coaches come training camp. So I think they're right there. And then I think we talked about, Orlando is maybe the other like obvious kind of like riser team that certainly, is shooting their shot this summer. And because of the second apron, like how long can they keep that group together? Like as young as they are, like they're also like up against a little bit of a ticking clock. So they're in an interesting position, but I think certainly they have a chance to be like a top 3 sort of threat. And then you get into teams like Atlanta and Detroit, as teams that will at least be like, I think
with Atlanta, especially, they are heavily linked to Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and if
Yeah.
that comes to fruition, you got him with Kristaps Porzingis and a healthy group. They're an interesting team, but it's not like in years past where there was a clear cut the Bucks and the Celtics, or the Celtics, the Knicks, and the 76ers, which some of us thought. Like, you're not going to have multiple clear cut, these are the teams that you're chasing. I think it's pretty clearly Cleveland, and then it's teams like Orlando of, okay, we think they're much better. Let's see how this comes together.
Teams with vulnerabilities, I think, is what, on paper, and it's super early. We haven't even gotten to free agency, but it feels like you're going to have teams with vulnerabilities, beyond maybe Cleveland. And again, like, who knows, maybe Atlanta sets the world on fire, whatever it might be. But at least one of those teams also that we mentioned is probably going to have like some terrible injury luck and they'll get knocked out. And, I look at Detroit and it's just like, I was looking at Detroit's roster. I'm just like, who is their second best player? Like, Cade is not like a Giannis or even Tatum level superstar, or even Brunson level superstar. Maybe he takes another step up to get closer to that. But like, it's kind of interesting. Like, they're constructed in a much more egalitarian sort of way beyond Cade. And it's like that formula like doesn't really seem to lend itself to like being like some sort of juggernaut. Like, I do kind of wonder, are they a team that like, they have their huge kind of lift, like takeoff season? Do they have like a season now where like it's a bit of a flat year? And then, which is why I think they need to be aggressive. I think Trajan Langdon said like they're not going to like go crazy. But I mean, they need another star is what I see when I look at them. And like
Another ball handler.
the Ivy Cunningham, it's not, I mean, like they took off like when Jaden Ivey was out and Dennis Schroeder was there. I don't know that that's a great endorsement of like Jaden Ivey's sort of like winning contributions at this point.
I mean, honestly, we shouldn't say it too loudly, but the whole Malik Beasley situation happening and that being put on pause is probably a good thing in disguise for the Pistons of like, are you really going to give that guy, as great as he is shooting the ball and as breakout of a season, record-breaking season as he had for him, but like, you're really giving the full non-tax mid-level to a one-way player like that isn't even going to be your second best player.
But was critical to their offense, right? Because like they don't have like a bunch of like really good creator offensive type guys.
Well, they got Tobias Harris.
There you go.
You need the shooting around K. Like that's the key part of it. Another ball handler, which is what I think that they hope Ivy can grow into. But again, like you're banking a lot on internal development too, with like a Ron Holland and seeing what a Sora Thompson can get you in this. So it's like some internal growth that I think they're banking on. But Malik Beasley was very, very crucial to their offense with his ability to stretch the floor and put those shots up quickly.
As we start to wrap here, free agency starting, what is it, 5:00 this afternoon Central Time? Yep. Do you think there's a name that will end up with the Bucks that we think, wow, really? I did not see that coming.
I don't know if I would put it on record of like they're going to get this guy, but there are two that I'm interested in because, as we've mentioned, the Bucks really just don't have much wing depth. Like Jake LaRavia is one for me. I'm interested to see what the market looks like for him coming out of Sacramento after being traded from Memphis. He kind of broke out a little bit while he was with Sacramento. And then I saw that New Orleans declined their team option on Brandon Boston Jr. And he's another one for me where I'm like, what's the market for Brandon Boston Jr., a 6'6" guard that can play some defense, shoot pretty decently, young guy too. Both of them are pretty young. So those are two names I'm like, what's the market like for him? And I'd be interested to see them in a Bucks jersey if the number could be right. But again, they're both really young players. So who knows what that value will be like for them in free agency.
Camille's really like getting some good clickbait names out there, like Brandon Boston, Jake LaRavia. That's going to be the all caps
for the title.
on the title. Like Bucks making moves for LaRavia.
Bucks bombshell, Brandon Boston.
Yeah, these are the
DJ Boston.
This is the Camille going much more like deep cut. This is more of like kind of our essence here. I mean the thing. I know we were talking before the pod, like I think certainly coming into the summer, I think we were mostly assuming like, well, Kyle Kuzma's going to be here because after what you saw in the playoffs, like, what are you getting for Kyle at this point? Like, you need to rehab the value and hope that he comes back and has a better shooting year and blah, blah, blah. Like, get him a full training camp, that kind of stuff. I don't know though, because like just looking at some of the transactions today, we were talking before we went on about Colin Sexton, and as much as like, I mean, the Hornets gave up like literally nothing. Like Yusuf Nurkic's expiring contract for him. They got a second round pick with him. Sexton's a guy obviously that's been connected to the Bucks, like going back a few years. He was a like favorite sort of fantasy trade target when, as a guy to potentially play with Drew, who I thought made sense. So like you look at kind of deals like that. I think first off, the Bucks, fortunately, they didn't have that much expiring salary. They really couldn't make an offer for him in the way that Charlotte could. Pat Connaughton just doesn't make enough money, ironically, in that respect. But you kind of wonder, like, is there anybody else like that who becomes, like literally just sort of like a distressed asset, or a team looks at the Bucks and says like, well, would they want Kuzma because maybe they have somebody who's owed more money over a longer period,
like 1 more year or something.
Yeah, something like that. Or, like there was, I think the mention, I forget who, maybe it was Brett Siegel or somebody said that like the Bucks might be interested in Wiggins, who I think there was maybe some soft Wiggins connections at last year's deadline as well.
Yeah.
Like there's never been an obvious kind of trade, I think, either when he was in Golden State or now Miami. Like, like do the Heat need Kyle Kuzma in some respect? No. Wiggins makes a little bit more money than Kuzma does. But that's if there was a quote unquote big move, I think that's sort of what I would be expecting. It would be something where it's like, it's not a real star, but it's somebody that, you feel like, okay, maybe if you kind of squint at it long enough, you could feel like maybe there's a guy who's sort of like a third player. I'm leaving Dame sort of in like the two, honor in the second honorary star position. So maybe is there somebody like that out there? Obviously, doesn't look like it's going to be Colin Sexton. But I think also like before Kevin Porter got run out of the league for his transgressions, I looked at Kevin Porter and Colin Sexton actually as like kind of similar, like young guys who seemed gettable, had kind of contracts around like 20 million. Could those have been guys that you could have paired with Drew as like kind of wild, like upside sort of swings? And obviously KPJ ended up here through like a very circuitous journey, to put it kindly. And so I think that also probably like makes you, if you can bring back KPJ and Gary Trent, and Ryan Rollins, then like, I think also like you're probably just less interested in paying 20 million a year for Colin Sexton. But I don't know, there may be other guys like that. Certainly tweet at us, hit us in the comments, etc. If there's kind of those other guys who might be kind of in that sweet spot, for the Bucks to target. And again, we haven't even kind of re-registered the topic of, do they put that 2031 first rounder into play? Because Kyle Kuzma plus that pick, that could actually fetch something. But you'd obviously want more than like Colin Sexton for if you're giving up the 2031 first.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one that's come up the most with that scenario has been Cam Johnson, and I mean, I would still want something else back other than just getting Cam Johnson if you're giving up a 2031 first.
And that seems extremely plausible given where Brooklyn is and what they're trying to do. Like they're trying to get also because they are a potential Giannis suitor. So teams like them they would look at that as like give us that now for Cam Johnson. And then if Giannis eventually asks out,
we can give it back to you.
We can give it back to you, and you control your 2031 destiny again. So I agree. Like that again, that becomes a playing with fire type thing. And is Cam Johnson good enough? I don't know. Like I definitely think he's better than Kyle Kuzma, but like is the delta worth that level of risk? Or again, as we've alluded to as well, like I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be unprotected, which if it was like top 5 protected, then I think you view that pick a bit differently putting into a trade. So that might be an interesting question. Like how little protection would need to be on that pick in order to get the Nets to bite on that, right? Like, is it top 5 protected in 2031 and then unprotected in 2032 or something like that? You know, there's all different kind of versions of the trade you could try to put together.
It's been some weird trades to start this off that you're like, well, can the Bucks do the same here? Can we get in on this where you're just waiting for whatever the negotiation process is?
We don't want DeAndre Ayton, right?
Well, right. But no trade. I think that
was kind of baked in. I mean, if Brook like leave, I mean, this is kind of those things like if Brook leaves and like DeAndre Ayton can come for the minimum, it's like, well, damn, I guess you're not going to get more talent.
All right, fine.
But also, I feel like Giannis would just like be like, F this guy. Like,
I don't see Giannis getting along with players that don't have a motor. Like, you can't just take off.
It's going to be interesting to monitor. So free agency begins today, and 5:00 Central Time is when we'll start to see more of these moves getting announced here. But the big ones from the Bucks: Bobby Portis has been re-signed, and now we just wait on players like Gary Trent Jr. The qualifying offer extended to Ryan Rollins. So he's a restricted free agent. We see what happens with the juniors and Brook Lopez. That'll do it for today's show. We're back later tomorrow, with another look at free agency, with it officially beginning. For Frank and Camille, I'm Justin. We'll talk with you once again tomorrow.